Welcome back to the Word on Fire show. I'm Matthew Petrusik, Senior Director of the Word on Fire Institute and the new host of the Word on Fire show. Thank you for joining us. Euthanasia and the culture of death. St. Pope John Paul II used the term culture of death in his 1995 encyclical Evangelium Vitae to capture the secular world's dark confluence of poisonous ideas and practices that lead directly and indirectly to spiritual and physical ruin. Sadly, the encyclical's warnings have only become more prophetic and more prescient over time. We've seen that the culture of death has advanced on many fronts, but today we'll be focusing on the increasing legalization of suicide in the United States and abroad. To date, 10 U.S. states and Washington, D.C. permit assisted suicide. Many more states, including our home state of Minnesota, are likely to legalize it in the near future. Here to discuss the issue and how Catholics can and should respond is Bishop Robert Barron. Well, Bishop, welcome back to the studio. Today we're talking about euthanasia and the culture of death, a rather dark topic. But before we get into it, what have you been up to recently? I heard that you recently did the rite of election.
The rite of election, which is a great thing I've done now for the past 8 years as a bishop. It's when, candidates and catechumens preparing for either baptism or full initiation of the church gather usually on the first Sunday of Lent. And it's a lovely ceremony, really. And they come up and they sign their names in the book, then I sign the name. And it's kind of enrolling them now into this final stage of the process. And so I went to one of our beautiful churches down in Austin, Minnesota, and folks came from all across the diocese. So I always enjoy that. And then that night, I left from that to go way up to the Twin Cities to a retreat center, actually just a little bit east on the Mississippi, and had a retreat with my priests. So every couple of years up here, they do that. So I spent 3 really nice days with the priests of Winona, Rochester, and we listened to talks and we attended the liturgy and just had a lot of, good fellowship together. So it was good.
Let's always remember that there are beautiful things happening all the time like that as we transition into talking about it today's topic.
Things are not all dark, right?
Yeah. So you recently wrote an article in Evangelization Culture Online entitled, "It's Not Your Life, It's Not Your Death, and It's Not Your Choice."
Mm-hmm.
And you wrote in response to a new law that if passed, it hasn't been passed yet, but if passed, would legalize assisted suicide right here in our home state of Minnesota.
Yeah.
Now, as the filming of it hasn't passed yet, but it's likely to, unless there's some significant resistance. Now, one of the challenges that we face, and your article touches on this, is at the terminological level, the words that are used in the nature of the debate. So, as you know, the Minnesota bill is called the End of Life Option Act, but other examples include death with dignity, voluntary assisted dying, physician-assisted suicide, and even borrowed from the abortion movement, my body, my choice. So the first question to address here is, what role has euphemism really played in this debate?
A lot. And all those suggest the primacy of, freedom and choice in our culture has become almost like a fetish. I took my article from a billboard that I saw in California many years ago. I was out there, and the same thing, this euthanasia bill was being considered. And the billboard simply had, "My life, my death, my choice." And it was meant to appeal euphemistically to this very reality. What struck me was how antipathetic that is to Paul, right? Whether you live or you die, you are the Lord's. It's not my life, it belongs to Christ. Not my death, that belongs to him too. So whether I live or die, I am the Lord's. There's a fundamental shift in consciousness from I belong to someone beyond myself. I belong to the Lord. My life does, my death does. It's not my choice. But then the modern, you're at this watershed. The modern view is just the opposite. No. Choice is absolutely preeminent. My life belongs to me. My death belongs to me, and it's up to me to choose. That's where the battle is really joined. It's a philosophical battle. So we can talk about the particular issues, but it's a basic philosophical dispute between, do you belong to someone higher beyond yourself, or are you utterly in your own possession? And we fetishize choice in our society. So pro-choice we associate with abortion, but that's a way of naming our whole culture.
Yeah.
You know, in a secular way, we have a pro-choice culture. Hey, as long as I chose it, that's okay. You can choose what you want. I'll choose what I want. But see, with that kind of relativism, any cohesion to the society breaks down. And in fact, the door is open to profound moral evil. When you say, in the first place is choice. Well, why not I choose to kill you? I choose to eliminate you. I choose you're in my way. You know, unless we're anchored in objective value, we are inviting moral chaos.
That's right. Now we're going to get deeper into the philosophical underpinnings of both the pro-euthanasia movement and the Catholic response. But sticking on this rhetorical point, just briefly, how should we describe the act of what they're calling assisted suicide or physician-assisted suicide? What's a good rhetorical strategy?
How about the taking of an innocent life? Something that's intrinsically evil. Go back to our last conversation. When you lose that category, you're at sea morally. So if you name it for what it is, like, you know, abortion, the taking of an innocent human life. Euthanasia, the taking of an innocent human life, I think is a far more descriptive term. And it's predicated upon this assumption of the intrinsically evil act. No matter how grim things have become, no matter how bad you feel, no matter what the good consequences might be, that act is in itself evil. And when the society loses sight of that, we're in serious trouble. So I would use that straightforward language of the taking of an innocent life.
So turning now to the components of the philosophical debate.
Yeah.
Pro-euthanasia advocates often appeal to two different principles. They mash them together, but they're actually two different principles to justify their position, the legalization of euthanasia. One is autonomy over one's own life and body,
Right.
and the other is compassion in the response to suffering. So before we dig in more deeply into each one of these and how they might be related to each other, what do you think these advocates have in mind when they're using autonomy and when they're using compassion?
Yeah, autonomy is the supreme modern value. Autonomos, I'm my own law. I decide. I'm opposed to any form of heteronomy, a nomos that comes from outside of me. I'm the Lord of my own life. So I was saying that distinction between the California billboard and Paul to the Romans, that's the fundamental distinction. But see, autonomy is not the great Christian value. You might put it this way, for a Christian, theonomy is the value. So not heteronomy, meaning like, now you boss me around. This other person has control over me. That's heteronomy. Theonomy is, no, God, theos, is the nomos of my life. God is the law of my life. If I say that, well, I become truly free because God is the supreme good. And if God becomes the law of my life, then my life is ordered toward the good. And that's freeing for me. That's liberating. That's the key to the happy life, right? So it's not autonomy that we hold up, but theonomy. But see, we've been cowed, though, in our culture. We Christians, we're cowed into privacy. So we can whisper that value among ourselves. No, we should proclaim it from the rooftops. That's the value that truly liberates us, not autonomy, but theonomy. Compassion, to suffer with, is what the word means, compatior. Fair enough. I mean, sure, someone that's suffering either physically, psychologically, spiritually, yeah, I have compassion with that person. But press it. If I want to love that person, right, and that's the great Christian value. Love means to will the good of the other. It doesn't mean simply I'm emotionally identifying with you, or I'm sympathizing. That's what that means. I have the same feeling as you do. Fine, but the value is love. Love means willing the good of the other. So you can't say that I'm expressing love by killing you. I can't take your life, take an innocent life, and say it's an expression of love. So I'd press it that way. It's not autonomy that we want, it's theonomy. It's not really compassion in itself. It's love that we want. Those are the Christian values.
In our contemporary culture, one of the issues is we've sort of lost our historical memory, and that includes the history of the development of ideas. Could you speak a little bit about the genealogy of the idea of autonomy and how really recent it is in terms of its both birth and now influence?
Yeah, I mean, you want to go really deep with it. I think it comes from a misconstrual of the nature of God. So when God was seen, as I often say, as ipsum esse, as the sheer act of to be itself, in which all created things participate, there's Thomas's vision. When that's lost, and that happened for a number of reasons, and God becomes more of a heteronymous figure, outside. Think of deism that was very influential at the founding of our country. Well, for a while you might put up with that God, but after a time, you're going to find that God oppressive. And how at home we are with that language, like an oppressive power from outside telling me what to do. Well, as I'm moving in that direction, I begin to say, look, I don't want that heteronomy. I want autonomy. I want to be free. I want to be the one that disposes of my own life. The key is recovering a proper sense of God, where God is not an other that's hovering threateningly outside my freedom. But God is the deepest ground of my own being. God is, I often use the image of the burning bush, right? That as God comes close, the world becomes more beautiful and more luminous. That's why I like the way you're pursuing the question, because all of these things, they're moral questions, yes, but then keep going. They're metaphysical questions. They depend upon basic metaphysical perceptions. In this case, the right understanding of God is not a threat to us, but is the one that makes us luminous and beautiful.
So let's now turn to the relationship between the principles of autonomy and compassion, still trying to understand the secular conception of them. Oftentimes they're presented together as if one implies the other. To be autonomous necessarily implies, showing compassion, and compassion implies autonomy. But are they really connected? For example, if we truly embrace the secular conception of autonomy, why would we limit assisted suicide only to those who are suffering, right?
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, if you absolutize autonomy, then you're completely in charge of your own life, and you can determine what your values are, and you can make every decision you want. Sure. And if, look, I have compassion for the suffering of people, well, then why not put them out of their misery? Why not, out of compassion, solve the problem? But we can't stay simply within that little narrow framework. You've got to move into the proper moral and metaphysical framework about the good and the seeking and finding of the true good. That's the metaphysical issue.
So proponents of assisted suicide often regard what's called the slippery slope argument as a straw man. And the argument says, well, look, if we legalize it, we're going to eventually use the same law to involuntarily kill those who are either incapacitated or otherwise incapable of resisting. And they respond to the argument, no, we can carefully construct the laws in a way, well, that will not happen. What's your response to that?
Well, the response is it's empirically false. I mean, you can see the slippery slope. Look in Canada, look in parts of Europe, where indeed these, originally rather restricted euthanasia laws have devolved very quickly into, very aggressive expressions of real violence toward people. So I don't think that's a theoretical issue at all. I think empirically you can see we're on a slippery slope. And you're always on the slippery slope, Matt, when you bracket the intrinsically evil category. No, it's not intrinsically evil. Under certain circumstances we can. And then you bring in, oh, sure, look how the person's suffering. And oh, look, what their own autonomy. Oh, look at the way their family's affected. Well, sure. Once that category of the intrinsically evil is gone, then you can justify anything. Can I go back? This is when I was a young guy in the seminary, and all the vogue at the time was this proportionalist ethic, which kind of had the same structure. There wasn't anything really intrinsically evil about a given act. It all depended on consequences, and you kind of measured good and bad, and then you made a proportional judgment, right? I remember taking that in, and there were bright, convincing people that were laying it out. But I remember the day, really, when it occurred to me, I could justify anything under this rubric. If this is the way to think about the moral life, I could, in principle, justify anything. Why not kill this person if there's enough good that comes from it? I mean, why not put this poor old person out of his misery if enough good comes from it? That's I would say, by its nature, a slippery slope scenario. Once I say no intrinsic evil, measure the good and evil, I can justify whatever I want. So I think the church has got to be a bulwark against that. Who else in our society is speaking these fundamental moral truths? I don't know. Like an academe, you're not going to find a lot of people who are defending classical morality. So the church, I think that's part of our job, to be a bulwark today.
So, Bishop, if someone comes to you and says, look, this is a foregone conclusion, this is what society wants, they want to head in this direction, so what we should do as a church is to try and make the laws as restrictive as possible, try to write the laws in such a way so that we'll avoid these unintended consequences down the line. You say what to that argument?
Well, no, if you're dealing with the intrinsic evil, you can't do that. There's a prudential argument, and we've engaged this around the abortion question. If there are some proposed laws that might restrict abortion, the church has said, okay, we'll accept whatever we can get. We're not conceding for a moment that abortion is anything but intrinsically evil. But if the society at the governmental level is willing to say, well, we'll set up certain restrictions, okay, I can accept that. So there's there's room for prudential judgment there, it seems to me. But you can never legislate in a way that allows for the intrinsically evil.
So another argument that pro-euthanasia advocates use is that when we're arguing from the Catholic standpoint, what we're really doing here is we're taking our irrational, preferential religious beliefs and imposing them on others. Is that a fair portrayal of the Catholic position?
No, and one of the great virtues of the Catholic intellectual tradition is that we embrace the natural law. And go back to John Courtney Murray and many others in the 20th century that saw that as a very promising way forward for American Catholics, is that we have a way of talking about the moral life that is not, it's indeed grounded in the Bible, that's true, but it's not reducible to the Bible. It can appeal more widely to any person of good mind and goodwill. It appeals to principles that any reasonable person should be able to accept. And so when we make our arguments, let's say about abortion, euthanasia, et cetera, we don't tend to go back to biblical examples. We don't say, well, the church teaches. We tend to rely upon these natural law principles. At the same time, I think it's okay to make explicit reference to the Bible. That is the ultimate ground of our ideas about the world and about morality. So I think, sure, appeal them. And if it works, great. If that will work in a public context, great. But we do have this natural law tradition. And look, imposition. Every law is imposing something on people. If I say, let's have a law that you can only drive, 65 miles an hour. Well, I'm imposing ultimately a moral vision on everybody, right? Why do you limit the speed? Well, so it makes the world safer and it'll save lives, right? That's a moral vision imposed through legislation. Well, all legislation, whether it's tax law, traffic laws, laws against homicide, et cetera, they all have a moral basis. They're all, at the end of the day, imposing a moral vision on people. So to me, it's a kind of a canard. It's a red herring to pull out the I'm imposing things. So I would take those two tacks in responding to that.
So this would apply more to the internal debate of the prudential level of how to address these societal problems, including euthanasia and abortion. What do you say to those who perhaps in like the tradition of Stanley Hauerwas would say things like, we just need to stay away from the natural law arguments. They haven't worked. They're unintelligible. They're ultimately philosophically unsuccessful. So let's only rely on the biblical witness.
Yeah, and I've always liked Hauerwas and find some of that compelling. Man, my bottom line is whatever works. I have kind of a Jamesian side, I suppose, like a pragmatist side, like whatever works. If a natural law argument is persuasive in the public forum, and that's supposed to be its virtue. Now, Hauerwas and company would say, look, they haven't been very persuasive in the public forum. I get that. But I would say if they work, great. If the biblical appeal works, great. Hauerwas, in fact, one time appeared before Congress, this is years ago, and it was an abortion, related debate. And they asked him, they said, Professor, could you provide, your argument against abortion? And he said, Christians don't kill their children. And the guy said, well, I understand that, but could you come up with an argument? He goes, no, that's my argument. Christians don't kill their children. So that was not appealing to the natural law, but appealing rather boldly and unapologetically to a biblical vision. I'd say whatever works, try it, use it. As a Catholic, I have an affection for the natural law tradition. I think it can and does persuade people. Not always, and maybe the Bible is more compelling to the public.
To draw it out and look at the implications of the way that we frame the debate, natural law and biblical, is it fair to say, though, that at some level we have to appeal to the natural law in the sense that we can't only appeal to revelation to have laws in a society? Is it fair to make that claim? Well,
it depends on how you construe it, because I suppose the natural law, I think, does have a relationship to the Bible, that it does find fundamental principles within the Bible. But yeah, you could say within a pluralist society, it's the only kind of reasonable appeal you can make, an appeal to, universal principles of reason and so on. So it's probably, the more effective route.
There's also a libertarian critique that goes something like this, the libertarian critique of the Catholic position. It says something like, well, assisted suicide may indeed be morally wrong, but it's not the state's job to get involved in moral disputes. So if you don't want to participate in assisted suicide, then don't, but let other people make their own choices. How do we respond to that argument?
Well, again, I go back to the purpose of law. There's always a moral purpose. And to that degree, the state's always involved in moral issues. And if you want, imposing morality on people. Why is the state involved in saying you can't murder people? Why is the state involved in saying you can't steal? Why is the state involved in saying you can't rape people? So, I think that's a exaggerated point of view. I get the libertarian, impulse behind it, but every law is imposing some kind of moral vision. So that's why, in that way, again, the Hauerwas side, you might say, well, look, you've got your moral framework. I got my moral framework. Let's have a debate in the public and see who wins. Let's bring our competing moral visions out in public and see who can out-narrate the other.
So a libertarian may even be sympathetic to that position, but say, okay, but what's the limiting principle within Catholic thought that says, well, here that the state does grant you freedom in these realms, and the state should not be involved in these realms?
Well, that goes back to Aquinas, where Thomas will say not everything that's morally wrong should be illegal. So famously, Aquinas says that, there should be a sector of the city where, prostitution, that people understand what's going on there and so on. And we know, that's what people are going there for, et cetera. But not everything that's immoral, and clearly he thought that was immoral, should be illegal. Now, the reason is sometimes making those things illegal produces far more problems and makes the situation more morally complicated. So should the church, in its full range of sexual teaching, should that be legally imposed? I would say no, for the same reason. It would cause, more moral problems. So that's a subtle point, but an important one. Yes, indeed, law is informed by morality, but not everything that's immoral should be illegal.
And within that framework, what's a stable principle for determining immoral but legal, immoral, illegal?
Yeah, there probably isn't, a super clear principle, except the one I articulated following Thomas, that in some cases making an immoral thing illegal causes more trouble in the society. It leads to greater division or greater, confusion, et cetera. So that's probably the best you can do in terms of a prudential principle.
Is it just as fair to say that intrinsically evil acts should always be illegal?
No, because again, look at the full range of Catholic sexual teaching. Would you make every part of that? We would recognize a number of that as intrinsically evil, but we wouldn't want laws against them necessarily.
I think this shows just how versatile and how nuanced the Catholic intellectual tradition is on these moral matters.
Yes, because it's a very old tradition and a very careful one. And someone like Aquinas, who represents a subtle view in whatever he says. But Paul VI said that, the church is an expert in humanity. And I've always liked that. I've savored that formulation. Given our 2,000-year history and great theoreticians, but also great pastoral people, at the practical level of hearing confessions and so on, it's made the church an expert in humanity. And so we kind of have a feel for how these things should work.
So to wrap things up, we've been responding to the deficiency of the pro-euthanasia position. But how can we state the Catholic view positively including how we would give a particular response to those who perhaps do have a terminal illness right now, those who are in states where they have the active choice that they could make right now. What do we tell them?
That they're loved by God and that life is beautiful and that they have dignity and that so their life should never be directly attacked. But also to emphasize that clinging to life in this world is not an absolute value. So the acceptance of death as a natural part of life, that's also a good thing. And so those who are opposed to euthanasia are not saying, by any and all means, cling to life. So the church talks about, ordinary and extraordinary means, for example, that we're not obligated to take any possible means to save our biological life. No, at a certain point, you can let go and allow yourself to die or allow another to die. We use that language. So we're not taking such an absolutist position that we're just trying to cling desperately to life in this world. We honor life, the dignity of life. You can't actively take it. But there's also, the legitimacy in accepting death, allowing someone to die. I think that's part of the nuance of the Catholic view.
And to those who say the church just doesn't understand how much I'm suffering or how much my loved one is suffering, how do we respond to that?
I think of all the people within the church who care for those who are dying. And, thank God for hospice programs and thank God, too, for the medical means we have now to alleviate, most forms of physical suffering as people approach death. The appeal to the horrific suffering people have. Yes, indeed, sometimes that still is the case. But most of the time now, we have the medical means to deal with that. But I would say that the church has so many people and institutions that care for those who are dying. We're well aware of those dynamics.
Well, thank you, Bishop. It's now time for our listener question. This one comes from Dara from Massachusetts, who asks about praying for the dead.
Okay.
Hi, Bishop Barron. My name is Dara. I live in Acton, Massachusetts. And I just have a quick question. I've had a season of quite a bit of loss, both friends and family, young and old. And I'm just wondering, why exactly do we pray for the dead? And can I pray for the dead souls of atheists and non-Catholics? Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. To the second part, yes, absolutely. Why do we pray for the dead? The same way, the reason we pray for the living, as an expression of solidarity in God. So we reach out to those who've gone to a different dimension, but are still in relation to us, still connected to us. And we pray for them the same way we pray for each other here on earth, for the divine help, the divine grace. And yeah, of course you can pray for anybody. God's mercy reaches out to all. And I think praying for the living and the dead, which is one of the spiritual works of mercy, expresses that. So absolutely.
Well, thank you so much, Bishop, for joining
You're
us
welcome.
again. Look forward to seeing you again soon on the Word on Fire show.
Good. Thanks, Matt.
That does it for us today. Thanks for joining us on the Word on Fire show. If you're interested in learning more about how Word on Fire can help you grow closer to Christ and become a better evangelist with and for others, consider joining the Word on Fire Institute. Check us out at institute.wordonfire.org. That's institute.wordonfire.org. See you next time.